Welcome to Unit 3, Identifying Ethical Dilemmas. To review, in Unit 2 we covered identifying ethical wrongs. We often face moral temptations in which we are tempted to do wrong for all sorts of reasons, some of which we covered in the previous unit. But in learning how to develop our systems to thinking so that we can engage in ethics in a more deliberative, conscious, and ethical way, we realize that there are ways to discern when we are facing a moral temptation, which is the first step to acting ethically. Before we move on to actually acting ethically, even when the right may be more difficult than the wrong, we need to discuss ethical dilemmas. That is, a situation in which we are not facing a right versus wrong choice, but we are facing a choice between two rights. So this is where we are in our 7 steps to acting ethically. We've already, in Unit 1, recognized an ethical moral issue and learned how to determine the actor. In Unit 2, we've gathered the relevant facts and identified ethical wrongs. And today in Unit 3, we're identifying ethical dilemmas. And then we can finally move on to making ethical decisions and acting. Note, if you have identified that you are indeed facing an ethical wrong, you should not go on to identify ethical dilemmas, because as Kidder notes, if you do, you are likely to justify a wrong as a right. So if you've identified an ethical wrong, and you are the actor whose actions would be committing the wrong, you just stop after step 4. You choose not to do the action. You may need the help from Unit 5 to learn how to do that. However, if you are the actor who is observing a potential wrong being committed, you may be facing an ethical dilemma. Regardless of whether you are or not, you'll need to learn the techniques for making the ethical decision. For example, do I report unethical conduct or don't I? So remember, if you're facing a moral temptation to commit a wrongdoing, for example, violation of law, regulations, or standards, departure from truth, or deviation from your moral compass, skip this step and go on to step 6, making a decision. Otherwise, you'll be likely to justify engaging in an ethical wrong. However, many times we are facing decisions between rights versus rights, not just moral temptations between rights versus wrongs. So what is a right? Well, it's a value or an action that upholds a fundamental value. So think back to Unit 1. We read about Kidder's 5 core values: fairness, honesty, respect, responsibility, and compassion. We read about ICAI's fundamental values: fairness, honesty, trustworthiness, respect, responsibility, and courage. Those are all rights. Now in Kidder's book, he talks about 8 rights in particular, and he pairs them off with one another. Justice versus mercy, individual versus community, short-term versus long-term, and truth versus loyalty. So an ethical dilemma is when we are facing a right versus right choice, when two of our most profound and central values are in conflict, but it's right to uphold both of them. Therefore, these are much more complicated and difficult than our moral temptations. For example, it is right to show loyalty to my friend by giving her my history paper, but it is also right to be truthful and say, no, I won't, because I think you might copy from it. You're under a lot of stress lately. Poor or no decision-making causes us to avoid resolving these dilemmas or resolving them in ways that result in a wrong being committed. For example, there's nothing that can be done about it. You believe that I should be honest, but I believe that I should be loyal, so I'm going to give my friend my paper. So in this scenario, the student is justifying violating academic integrity standards because she has decided that loyalty should be prefaced above honesty, and she defines loyalty as giving her friend her paper when she's asked for it. We're going to continue to talk in this quarter about how you can resolve dilemmas by finding an alternative solution that upholds both rights. But that's for the next unit. But here in this quote, you can see that the student is just trying to justify doing what she wanted to do without really thinking through the whole scenario. Also in this case, I know that the organization doesn't want me to use my work computer for personal tasks, but I can't afford to buy my own computer, so I'll have to sacrifice the community's rules in order to satisfy my own needs. This is a kind of ethical thinking, or falsified ethical thinking called egoism, where we think it's okay as long as we're putting our needs, we're meeting our own needs. And it's not wrong to privilege your needs or to put your needs ahead, but if they're in conflict with the community's needs, it's much more complicated than simply throwing away the other side of the equation. Or in this one, my coworker constantly lies about being sick. She's told me. And our boss has just asked me point blank if I know about the injustice he's heard about. But I feel such compassion for my coworker, so it's right for me to lie about it. Here we're facing a justice versus a mercy dilemma theoretically, but really, again, the person is just throwing away one and choosing the other without really thinking through it. And in each of those cases, we saw that a wrong was being committed as a way to resolve an ethical dilemma, when that may not always need to be the case. So ethics isn't just about these big headline size or right versus wrong issues that we hear about in the news and we think about, and therefore we place them off into the distance as if these would never happen to us. Ethics is about the everyday decisions that need to be made when two equally right choices conflict. So when do you test for a right versus right for an ethical dilemma? Well, first, after you've already put the situation through all the right versus wrong tests, and it's passed all of them. In other words, you're not facing a wrong. You are facing a true dilemma between two equally valid rights to uphold. Then you need to determine what sort of dilemma is this. Is it a truth versus loyalty dilemma, a short-term versus long-term, an individual versus community, or a justice versus mercy? Kidder says that there are benefits for determining which dilemma it is rather than just trying to make a decision. It reduces the complexity of ethical dilemmas into a manageable problem. It gets to the heart of the matter. I am looking at upholding truth or upholding loyalty. And it also acts as a second test of moral temptation. So when we do that, we can begin to see that I'm recasting a moral temptation as an ethical dilemma. So picture this scenario. It's a famous trolley example. It's been used for decades in ethics. I took it from Bazerman and Tenbunzel. And here it is. You're a head engineer for Amtrak, and you see that, quote, a runaway trolley is headed for 5 railway workers who will be killed if it proceeds on its present course. The only way to save these people is to hit a switch that will turn the trolley onto a sidetrack where it will run over and kill 1 worker instead of 5. What do you do? Most ethicists would cast this as an ethical dilemma. It is right to want to save the 1 person, the 1 worker, but it is also right to save the 5 workers. And so the person in this situation is really facing an ethical dilemma. What do I do? Now, we're not making decisions this week. That's next week. And next week we can revisit this scenario with our decision-making frameworks. But for this week, I just want you to see how this is an ethical dilemma. We really are facing a choice between upholding the life of 1 or upholding the life of 5. You could probably cast this as an individual versus community decision, because many more people in the community will be harmed if 5 people die than if 1 person dies. So how do you test for rights versus rights? Read Kidder's chapters 5 and 6 for details about the 4 dilemma paradigms that I've already mentioned. And then to test whether a scenario is a right versus right dilemma, you go through that scenario with each of those dilemmas, and he shows you how to do that. And once you've done that, once you've applied each paradigm, you determine which one is the best fit. That doesn't mean that the other ones aren't relevant or don't fit somewhat, but there's almost always a best fit from the perspectives of all the people involved. What paradigm is the best fit? Now remember, when talking about ethical dilemmas, force yourself to talk about them in terms of a right versus right. Otherwise, you can easily disguise a moral temptation as an ethical dilemma. For example, we hear students do this all the time, truth versus loyalty. The wrong way to talk about this is as follows. I don't want to lie to my boss, but it is right to be loyal to my coworker. So in that, we're really recasting it as a right, or we're saying it's a right versus wrong. It's right to say It is right to tell the truth to my boss, but it is also right to be loyal to my coworker. If you truly want to get at whether you're looking at a moral temptation or ethical dilemma, you have to use the rights versus rights language. And if it doesn't fit, you're probably recasting it as a moral temptation. Let's look at another one, justice versus mercy. The wrong way to talk about this is, it's not right for an engineer to sign off on a project he didn't inspect, but it's also right for us to forgive her for that one mistake. The right way to talk about it is right for an engineer to be sanctioned for misconduct, but it is also right to show compassion for human error. So in the second one, we're seeing it's right to uphold justice, and it's also right to uphold mercy. So in this case, we're not talking about the engineer's actions and whether they were right or wrong, because they were clearly wrong. She signed off on a project she didn't inspect. That's wrong. But we're talking about our response to knowing that she committed a wrong, and that truly is a right versus right dilemma. It's right to uphold justice and sanction everybody equally for misconduct. It's also right to show compassion for human error. So some final thoughts. Be careful about working backwards. This is Kidder's greatest caution. People will often decide on an action and then attempt to justify the action by casting it as a right. We've seen this already in some of the examples we've given you. And another reminder, we just talked about this. It's critical to ensure that you understand the difference between moral temptations and ethical dilemmas. Otherwise, we use ethical dilemma language to justify wrongs. Let's look at some more examples. This is an ethical dilemma because I want to be loyal to my friend, but I also don't want to get in trouble for cheating. Right? So again, the person's considering engaging in a wrong and justifying it as an ethical dilemma. In this one, I'm facing a dilemma. It's right for me to help myself by doing whatever I need to do to get an A, but it is also right for me not to break the rules of the community. Now this one's okay as long as doing whatever I need to is always on the ethical side of things versus cheating or corruption. And finally, I can't decide. Should I think short-term and do what I need to do to get the results, or think long-term and avoid punishment for doing something wrong? So you can see in this case, all three scenarios, a person's really considering doing a wrong, or cheating, or lying, or something, and they're like, oh yeah, but it's a short-term versus long-term, or it's an individual versus community decision. That's the danger of this backwards reasoning where we're morally tempted, and we're going to try and justify it or rationalize it with ethical dilemma language. And final reminder, you need to apply each test before making a decision. Apply the test by using the language of rights, not wrongs. And if you can't find the two rights quickly and easily, it probably isn't an ethical dilemma after all. That's it. It's a short lecture this week because the majority of information is in Kidder. I just wanted to highlight some key areas and give you some key reminders as you read through that material.